Hi, my name is Chelsea from 25th and Mag, and today we're on the third part of my Learn to Quilt series, where I teach you how to make my free Gridline Quilt Pattern from start to finish. So in today's video, we're going to learn how to make binding and bind our quilt. This is the very last step of the process, so by the end of this video, we should have a finished quilt. So typically in your quilt pattern's fabric requirements, they will call for how much fabric for binding and how many width of fabric strips you need. So for the Gridline quilt, I call for 1/2 yard of fabric and to cut 6 2.5 inch width of fabric strips. So to cut those strips, we first will have our fabric folded in half and folded in half again. So there should be 4 layers of fabric, and make sure everything is smooth, just as we did before when we were sewing our Gridline quilt. And then anytime we are cutting from our fabric, we want to square off that first edge so everything is straight. So I'm getting my 12.5 inch ruler and lining it along the bottom where the fabric fold is, and then cutting through all 4 layers of fabric to make sure there is a square 90-degree angle when I cut the fabric. And now we will begin cutting our 6 2.5 inch by width of fabric strips. So with binding, some people prefer to use 2.25 inches. Some people prefer wider than 2.5 inches. I find that 2.5 inches is kind of that sweet spot to give you enough fabric to easily bind your quilt without too much hanging over or it being too wide. So now we will just cut all 6 strips from our fabric. And just a reminder to occasionally check that left side edge to make sure it's still at a 90-degree angle with that folded bottom. So now we have 6 2.5 inch by width of fabric strips, and we have a little extra fabric, so feel free to save that for a future project. And now we will sew all of these binding strips into one continuous strip. So the first step to doing this is we need to trim off that selvage edge. I'm just using a smaller ruler to line up with the rest of the binding and square off that edge. So now we will sew these into one continuous strip. So one way that's much easier to do this is just to put your strips right sides together and sew a straight 1/4 inch seam along each. And this will give you a straight binding. The downside to doing this is when you fold it over, that seam will get a bit thick. So I highly recommend doing your binding this way that I'm going to show you now. So right sides together, you want to create this backwards L shape and line up these into a squared corner. And now you'll get a fabric marking pen and a ruler, and line up that ruler with the corners of these 2 binding strips and draw a straight line in between them. And then grab a couple sewing pins to pin those together. And then you'll take this to your machine and sew right on top of that line that you marked. So then once sewn together, you'll get a seam that is angled, and when you fold it over, it won't be as bulky. So as you can see here, I sewed right on top of that line that I marked, and then I'm going to get a ruler and measure a 1/4 inch from that line that I sewed to trim off any excess fabric. And then what I will do is I will press that seam open. And you will continue to do this down each strip. Just make sure that you are keeping it right sides together. So where you have that nice side, just pull the strip along to make sure the right side faces up. And then when you get your second strip, you'll have that right side down facing the right side of the other strip. And continue those steps to get one continuous binding strip. So now I've sewn all of these strips together and pressed all of those seams open. And the next step to preparing our binding is we will fold it in half with wrong sides together. So I'll take this over to my ironing board and press this binding strip in its entirety, and then I have it ready to sew onto my quilt. So in my last video, I showed how to trim your quilt top to prepare it to sew binding. And what you will do is you will take the binding and that edge that is not folded, so where you have the 2 edges of fabric, that is what you will align to the right side of your quilt. And I start on a middle point of the quilt, and I will pin the binding to the quilt with about 10 to 12 inches of overhang, and I use a clip like this just to mark where I need to begin sewing. And just a note, this is how I like to bind my quilt. Some people prefer to start binding from the wrong side. There are so many ways to do it, and this is just how I like to. So to start, you want to make sure you have a walking foot on your machine. It's going to make it so much easier. So now I'll take my quilt over to my machine, and where I put that clip is where I will begin sewing the binding. And as far as stitch length goes, I recommend your standard about 2.5, and I sewed this on with a 1/4 inch seam. And some quilters like to pin or clip their binding onto their quilt before they start sewing. Personally, I don't really like to do that. I find that it adds a lot of time for me, and I don't think it's super necessary as long as you sew slow and make sure that you are sewing accurately. But one thing I do check before I start sewing is I make sure the starting point that I do, that a seam of the binding doesn't fall on a corner of the quilt. So I just check with my hands and hold it up. If you have the seam at a corner of the quilt, it just adds a lot of bulk, so that's one thing I do like to check. So continue sewing your binding until you approach the corner of the quilt and stop with your needle down. So take your binding and fold it up and to the right, and have that fold at a 45-degree angle coming out of the corner, and give it a good press with your fingers till it leaves a mark in the binding. And then I like to use a fabric marking pen just to draw a line over that mark so I could really see it. And then continue sewing until the needle gets right to that mark you made, and backstitch a couple times to lock it in place. Now rotate your quilt 90 degrees so the binding is at the top part of the quilt. So to do the corner, we fold our binding again at that mark that we made at 45 degrees, and then we fold it down until that second fold is aligned at the top of the quilt. And one more time in case you missed it, fold again at the 45-degree mark, and then we will fold it at a straight line along that top edge. And if you did it correctly, you will have this little flap, and then we can continue sewing our binding on. So we will start right at that edge where there's that fold and backstitch a couple times to lock it in place, and then we will continue sewing straight at a 1/4 inch all the way down until we get to our next corner, and repeat those same steps. And once we reach the end of our binding, we want to stop when there is about a 10 to 12 inch gap from where we started sewing the binding on. And when you get to that end, just backstitch a couple times to lock it in place. So now I'm taking my quilt to my cutting table, and as you can see, I have about 10 inches of space in between where I stopped and started the binding. And now we need to connect these two pieces to finish the quilt. So just as we did when we sewed the binding together, one option is to sew these together with a straight seam. And to do this, you will crease them just so they meet, and then use a marking pen to mark a 1/4 inch from that fold. And then what you'll do is you will trim where you marked a 1/4 inch from the fold and sew these right sides together in a straight stitch. Again, the downside to doing this is you will end up with a pretty thick seam in that one spot, and it'll make it harder to sew over. So again, I recommend doing this next way. You'll have a much easier time sewing it on the back. So what I recommend doing instead is taking one side of that binding and cutting it about 2/3 in that gap, and this cut will be perpendicular to that edge. So now use your fingers to really smooth out that binding, and the other side we now need to cut. So again, smooth that out with your fingers and take that piece you just cut of binding and unfold it. And now we're going to align this scrap piece with that right side of the previously cut binding. And this is just a marking tool to cut this other side. So since we have 2.5 inch binding, this cut is going to overlap 2.5 inches to the underside. And make sure when you cut, you are only cutting that new piece of binding and you're not accidentally cutting the old piece. So I like to just use a marking pen to mark where I'm going to cut, and then pull away that strip just so I don't accidentally cut multiple layers. And now as you can see, our binding overlaps by 2.5 inches approximately in the center of that open gap. And now we need to sew these binding strips together. So with solid fabric, it can be a bit hard to tell which is the right side. So I like to get my fabric marking pen and just make a little dot on the right side of both sides of the binding to make sure I sew the correct sides together. And I recommend folding up your quilt and using clips or pins to bring them together. This will make your binding much easier to sew. So now we will unfold our left side of the binding and make sure that the right side is facing up where we made that mark. And now we take the right side and we want to put them right sides together, and they are going to come together into this point. Now I recommend getting a couple pins to pin these pieces together like this so they don't come apart. And this step can be a little difficult, just sometimes with the bulk of the quilt and bringing them together, they don't want to line up perfectly, so definitely take your time pinning and get them aligned. And just as we did before with the binding, we are going to use our fabric marking pen to draw a straight line in between where these two binding strips meet up. And now you'll take this over to your machine and sew right on top of that line that you just made. So now you can take out your pins and your clips from your quilt and unfold this to make sure that you sewed this correctly. So if you sewed this correctly, you will see the right side of the seam facing flat, and you'll have a little bulk inside the binding, and trim that a 1/4 inch away from the seam. So use your fingers to press that seam open, and you may need to take it to your iron to press that whole binding. It might have gotten a little wrinkled just from sewing it together. And now you want to take this back to your machine and sew the rest of that seam with a 1/4 inch back stitching at each end. And so now what you'll do is you'll take your quilt over to your ironing board and press the binding out. And when you get to the corners, just press it as close to the corner as you can, but you won't be able to press the corner entirely. So now we're on the last step of sewing on our binding. So something to make this easier is you can take your quilt over to the ironing board and fold over that binding and give it a good press. And then I recommend using quilt clips to hold it in place as you sew. And now to prepare the corner, what you'll do is use your finger to push out the quilt top in the binding a little bit, and then fold over one side and clip in place. And then with the other side of binding unfolded, flatten that to create a 45-degree angle, and then take that other side of the binding and fold over. This will give you a nice cornered edge. So I like to use a clip to hold the corner in place and then add another clip to the side of the binding. And something to keep in mind is where you sew on the binding from the back, you will see those stitches in the front. So just try to be consistent when you clip the binding fold. So now position the quilt to start stitching in between two of those clips, and you'll want to sew as close to the edge of the binding as possible. And I like doing this because I like the way the stitches look from the front. I get a nice stitched border, but something else you could do is start stitching the binding onto the back and then fold over and stitch from the front. It's entirely up to you which you think looks better. So I like to do a stitch length of about 2.5 and start by stitching a couple back stitches to hold it in place. And just stitch down the length of your quilt until you get to a corner. So when I start getting close to the corner, I like to remove the quilt clips and use my fingers to just hold on to that cornered edge. And you will sew right to that folded edge of the binding and stop with your needle in the down position. And lift your presser foot up, but still keep the needle down, and rotate your quilt 90 degrees. And from here, you will just continue sewing. Sometimes in the corners, I do like to give it a back stitch just to make it extra secure, but you will continue sewing down the length of your quilt and repeat these same steps at each corner. And after you've sewn all the way around, you'll just backstitch at the end where you meet where you started. So this is how I typically stitch my binding. Personally, I love the way it looks having this stitched border on the front of the quilt and the binding stitched to the back. But as I said earlier, this is something that you can switch around. Some people even prefer to hand stitch their binding. There are so many ways to attach binding to your quilt, but this is my preferred method. And now you have hopefully a finished quilt. And be sure to check out my free Gridline Quilt Pattern where I guide you through sewing this quilt from start to finish.